Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves postcast. I am live following the Timberwolves loss to the Phoenix Suns on the road on Tuesday night. The Locked On Wolves postcast starts right now.
You are Locked On Wolves postcast, part of Locked On Sports Minnesota, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beacon. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Typically on the live postcast, Marnie Gellner, Valley Sports North, is with us. This game was a TNT game. Marnie had the night off, and I'm going solo on the postcast. We're going to keep it to about 10 minutes of quick thoughts here from the Wolves' loss to the Suns, immediate reaction. Following the loss, it's obviously late. We're now past midnight in Minnesota in the central time zone. So appreciate everyone tuning in now and also watching this after the fact. We will do a full post-game podcast as well that'll post a little bit later Wednesday morning. So stay tuned for that. My biggest takeaway from this one, of course, the Wolves lose to the Suns ended up losing by 9. This was a game the Wolves got down by as many as 18 points in the third quarter. They fought back to within just a couple of possessions in the fourth and really were within striking distance for much of the fourth quarter. I mean, the biggest takeaway here for me is in game number 8, we finally saw this team compete and play hard for a full 48 minutes. And, you know, it's kind of sad that's where we're at. Like that's not a really exciting takeaway that they actually played hard, but really other than arguably the win over the Spurs a week ago, last Wednesday after the embarrassing blowout, a couple days prior, this is the only other game where it really felt like you got basically 48 minutes of great effort. And surely the quality opponent, easily the best team they played all season. The Suns had just one loss, had 5-game winning streak, undefeated at home. Everybody knows, when they win 64 games last year, conference finals team a couple of years ago. This is a team that the Wolves, no doubt those players got up to play this game. And it was a TNT game, right? It was basically the only show in town, late in the evening on Tuesday. These guys were ready to play. They played hard throughout. And that was huge. Early in the game, the issues were really missed shots. And, you go back to Sunday, the Wolves only made 4 3-pointers against the Spurs. And I came on the show afterwards and said, hey, they shot like 14% from 3, but that wasn't the biggest issue in this game. The biggest issue was perimeter defense in that game. In this game, the biggest issue early, it was shooting. The Wolves the offense wasn't too bad in the first quarter. I thought the ball movement was good. They ran their offense through Karl-Anthony Towns. He had, I think, 3 assists in the first quarter and probably should have had a couple more. The offense, the actual execution or the execution of the actual sets wasn't terrible. It was making open shots that was an issue. And it was pretty much across the board. Even Towns wasn't shot making from the field. He was like one of his first 7 to start the game. So early in the game, it was missed shots. And that was kind of the defense was fine. I thought the defense was pretty good. The Suns were getting some of their mid-range jumpers that the Wolves, are generally pretty happy to give up in drop coverage. And I said on the show Tuesday morning, previewing this matchup, that the Suns are a nightmare matchup for the Wolves, even without DeAndre Ayton, because Chris Paul and Devin Booker are 2 of the best mid-range shooters in the league. Chris Paul, probably the best mid-range shooter of this generation. And, the Wolves, that's the shot the Wolves are happy to give up, because for most teams, that's an extremely inefficient shot. But early in the game, that was really the only thing the Suns could get going. They were missing 3-pointers. They were taking them and missing them. The Wolves are pretty much dominating the paint. And then the second half of the game, things kind of flipped. And the third quarter was all about the Wolves defense struggling. They couldn't stop the Suns. The Suns were knocking down threes. They were getting driving kick opportunities wide open. And then the offense kind of devolved into what we've seen in the third quarter for, I think, 7 of the 8 games or 6 of the 8 games so far this season. I think maybe the Lakers win last Friday was basically the only exception to just terrible third quarters. The offense devolved into the my turn, your turn offense, or what Chris Finch has called the take turn offense, where it's like, okay, it's Ant's turn to try and take over. Now it's Cat's turn. Now it's D'Lo's turn. And everybody just in a good way wants to put the team on their back, but it doesn't work. That's not how Chris Finch's offense is built. That's not how this team is built. And still at times trying to force feed Rudy Gobert, which is that's another conversation, but some of those minutes are still so awkward with him, in the paint and kind of clogging things up when Ant's trying to drive, and occasionally when Towns is trying to drive from the perimeter as well. So the take turn offense plus paired with this struggling defense in the third quarter was obviously a major issue. And then late in the game, the Wolves got back with it to within 4. It was the bench unit that did it. It was the bench plus Cat, and then the bench plus Rudy. Rudy subbed in for Cat. And it was 4 bench players plus one of the starting bigs that got the Wolves to back within 4 points, and actually to within 2 points. The Suns hit a couple of free throws, and then after a timeout came before the free throws. The Wolves come down the floor, and I would put money on this not being what Chris Finch called, but Ant waved Rudy off, called for an isolation on the left wing, and took a really tough contested mid-range jumper that he missed. The Suns came back the other way, got an open 3. Jordan McLaughlin came down, scored. This is like early in the fourth quarter, scored on the baseline. The Suns come down, score again. And then Jalen Noel goes isolation on the other end of the floor, misses the shot. The Suns get a layup in transition, and the Wolves are suddenly down 7 at that point. It really snowballed quickly because the Wolves still just have this, they have to play an isolation ball at some, like they just kind of flip back into it. And, Ant is the biggest culprit, but he's not the only culprit. And then defensively late in the game, as the Wolves were kind of hovering and the offense did kind of kick back into gear mid-fourth quarter, there was a little bit of selfishness defensively, some gambling, and Chris Paul eats that up. Chris Paul was slicing and dicing drop coverage throughout the night. But we saw a lot of that in the fourth quarter where he was just kind of getting into the teeth of the defense and kicking out to the perimeter. He threw a crazy skip pass from like just inside the right slot to the opposite corner. Just like masterclass Chris Paul. And it was right after the bench unit without Chris Paul on the floor for the Suns, the all bench unit for Phoenix had kind of given away their lead. And Chris Paul and the starters come back in and just kind of show them how it's done. And that was kind of how this game ended. Was the Wolves were just unable to stop Chris Paul in the half court late in the game. All right, I want to hit a couple of other key takeaways here in just a second. First, so let's talk about our title sponsors of tonight's postcast. That is, of course, our friends at LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps people find the right people for their team faster and for free. It's absolutely easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn. You simply add your job, and then you add the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right. A couple additional takeaways from this one. I think something the Wolves are going to have to figure out, and probably pretty quickly, because the Suns, I think, are one of the first teams to like really do this consistently. But the Wolves will need to have an answer for teams that instead of isolating against Karl-Anthony Towns on the perimeter, they're screening him. This was one of the initial worries about the Wolves trading for Rudy Gobert. It was like, oh, teams will play 5 out. Cat will have to guard quicker forwards. He'll have to guard them in isolation and one-on-one situations on an island. And Cat's actually mostly been good at that and hasn't been put in too many of those situations that he hasn't been able to hold his own. It's in this game, Phoenix was setting back picks on Towns. They were setting really any kind of screen you could think of to free up shooters and then to force him to fight through ball screens to chase his man on the perimeter. And the Suns got a bunch of open threes off of this action. And it wasn't really Towns' fault the way that these screens are being set. And also, it's just really hard for somebody who's 6'11" to fight through these screens and contest a three-pointer and not foul. And that was an issue in this game. It's how Phoenix got a lot of their early offense really throughout the first half and built a little bit of a lead before halftime. And Phoenix was playing 4 or 5 out. When Biyombo was in the game, they were really kind of playing 4 up, but then they'd put Jock Landale in the game and they'd play 5 out. And the Wolves couldn't really do much with that. And obviously, Rudy's not going to be any better if he gets put in that action. And for the most part, the Wolves avoided that. But even in drop coverage, Gobert struggled a little bit to get out and contest some threes in this game. The Wolves' help defense was spotty. But the Towns fighting through screens thing will be a really interesting thing to keep track of. Now, he's not any worse at it than, I don't know, any other Timberwolves perimeter defender, right? I mean, D'Angelo Russell would be the best example of somebody who's really struggled to get through screens this year. Jalen Noel at times as well. They're probably the two biggest culprits in terms of perimeter defenders for the Wolves. And just lack of stick-to-itiveness, lack of ability to get through screens to be a pest on the perimeter. And then, by the way, you see Jordan McLaughlin, and he comes into the game, he will not let himself be screened. There were a couple of plays where he forced the ball way out towards the timeline because he was aggressively overplaying, almost like that was the idea, almost like it was like a half-court trap of some kind where he was pushing the ball out to the perimeter as far as possible. You don't see that from D'Angelo Russell. You just don't. You don't see it from Jalen Noel. Anthony Edwards, as usual, it's kind of spotty, right? It's on and off. So that was another thing that I noticed that was an issue. Obviously, turnovers are a big deal. I mentioned this earlier in passing, but the Wolves had 16 turnovers. Phoenix only had 9, which, by the way, TNT mentioned this a couple of times. The Wolves had by far the longest streak in the league of forcing opponents into 10 or more turnovers in a game, 85 consecutive games, obviously going back to the basically the start of last season. And that came to an end. Phoenix only had 2 first-half turnovers, finished the game with 9 turnovers. And the Wolves they only scored 6 points on the fast break. And I talked about this the other day on the show on Locked On Wolves, is that the Wolves, when their offense is struggling so much in the half court as it has for much of the season, they need transition buckets because they need the easy baskets. And also it can help jumpstart the offense. They can get some open threes. They can get some dunks and layups and get fouled, get opponents in the penalty. And that didn't really happen in this game either. 6 fast break points, only forced 9 turnovers. And then to make matters much, much worse is they committed 16 of their own turnovers, many of them just extremely sloppy plays. And with how well they played defensively for much of the game and then eventually started shooting the ball much better, that was really, really kind of an issue for this team, was turnovers. That was probably the biggest issue in this game, beyond some of the early missed shots and I mentioned earlier the defensive issues in the third quarter. The game long issue was the sloppiness with the ball. Anthony Edwards, D'Angelo Russell, 2 biggest culprits in this game, I think, in terms of open floor decision making, and some big mistakes there. The last point would be Jalen Noel. Jalen had a rough game. And I'm a huge Jalen Noel fan. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know that he shot 4 of 13 in this game. I know he had a team high plus 14 plus minus. Don't pay attention to that. He had 4 assists. This was just tough decision-making for Jalen Noel. He's got to be able to pass the ball a little bit more, especially when he's been asked to initiate some offense. And he was asked to do that in this game. There was a couple brief minutes in the second half where he was actually running point for the Wolves. And he's always a shoot first guy, and that's fine. And he's such a dynamic 3-level scorer. I really believe that. But the decision-making has to be tightened up a little bit for Noah. I think he's really bought into this, like, hey, I'm the 6th man, I got to go score mentality, which they need to have. But in this game, it was just a little too sloppy, and didn't really help the Wolves bench hold up their end of the bargain. I will say, though, Naz Reid, of course, was fantastic. You could argue he was the best player on the floor for the Wolves in this one, outside of maybe Towns' first quarter. And Jordan McLaughlin is very good, too, off the bench for the Wolves. All right, that's all I have for you on the postcast. I will have a full 30-minute or so podcast that'll post Wednesday morning, breaking down the game as I always do. I'll talk a little more about my biggest takeaway. I'll get into individual studs and duds as well, as we always do on the postgame podcast. Typically on the live show, we'll have Marnie Gellner on from Valley Sports North. So Friday night following Wolves Bucks, we'll have Marnie on about 45 minutes following the game when she's done with the Valley Sports North postgame. So be sure to subscribe to the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, and you'll be able to watch that live right here on YouTube on Friday as well. And, of course, regular Locked On Wolves podcast on the Locked On Wolves feed, YouTube, and anywhere you listen to podcasts daily, Monday through Friday, throughout the season and throughout the offseason. So be sure you're following and subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all we have for you today here on the live postcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.